welcome and thank you for coming to hear from me. We are going to talk through some issues with bug bounties and AI, but I assure you that even if you are not involved in bug bounties at all, this affects our entire industry and really multiple industries around the world. So some of these effects we're feeling in the labor market, some of these effects we can't quite predict, and some we do have some historical predictions to guide us through. So how many of you, before I get started, are involved in bug bounties in any way, either running them, hunting for bugs, reporting them? Absolutely none of you. Okay, this talk is going to be for all of you. So I will take you through a brief history lesson. Back in the day, so we all use tools in our work, right, these days. Way back in the day, there were no tools. So if you are familiar with any of the vulnerability discovery tools that exist today, even before AI, none of those existed at the dawn of hacker history. We had to write our own, and more importantly, we had to learn from each other. This was something where our communities sort of naturally coalesced in the, the virtual basements of the early internet. It was community-based learning, and where I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, there were a lot of hackers, turns out. So my curiosity at a young age translated into, being part of this community that grew this industry over time. And every piece of this industry that deals with vulnerabilities, the exploitation of vulnerabilities in any way, initially grew out of these early communities. So back in the birth of modern bug bounties, 3 out of 4 of these programs were ones that I started. So I didn't work at Google. I didn't start their bug bounty program. But I did start Microsoft's first bug bounty program. I also started Hack the Pentagon, that was based in part on what we learned in creating Microsoft's bug bounty program. And a lot of people these days view bug bounties as an inevitable evolutionary step in a lot of organizations' security maturity. But I can tell you that at the biggest software company in the world, at the time, they had actually publicly vowed to never pay hackers for vulnerability information. In fact, they were getting over 250,000 to 400,000 non-spam email messages a day of hackers reporting bugs for free to Microsoft. And the only payment at the time was your name in, 11-point Arial font in a Microsoft security bulletin. So while that was great that we were getting all these bugs for free, there were certainly a lot of bugs that we weren't getting. And there were a lot of bugs that we were getting through defensive brokers who would offer some kind of defensive bounty. How many of you have heard of ZDI, the Zero-Day Initiative, right? Exploitation contest that still goes on today. But even if we were getting those vulnerabilities through those defensive market brokers, those defensive market brokers, 1, knew about the vulnerabilities and technical details, and that created risk. And 2, they put a deadline on disclosure. And so what I was able to prove with the early days of Microsoft's bug bounties was, look, we want to hear about these vulnerabilities first, and ideally exclusively privately. So it's still a good idea for us to create some incentives. And the other thing, remember the Microsoft Security Bulletin that was the only incentive for researchers to report things to us was that they would get their name up in 11-point Arial font lights. That was not available for any bugs that they reported that only affected beta software. So if we had a public beta, we would not learn about those bugs until after the beta period was over. Worst possible time for us to hear about those bugs. And reporters started noticing that there was an insane amount of security patching right after the beta period was over. Looked very awkward for us. And in fact, one of the first justifications for creating the bug bounties was putting a bounty at the beginning of the beta period for, at the time, the browser known as IE. We were able to shape the traffic of these researchers who were already willing to come to us, but had no reason to do so until the worst possible time before those bounties existed. So part of that sort of engineering how the research community worked with a company they were already working with is what went into shaping Hack the Pentagon. That was the very first time that the US government had legally invited and allowed hackers to hack them. And I remember being in a meeting where a guy from some agency in the United States said, well, this is a terrible idea. And it's absolutely not going to be called Hack the Pentagon. It was obviously called Hack the Pentagon for good reasons. I think that at that point, 2016, was when there was this idea that, wait a minute, not only can we engage with hackers in this useful way, we can offer them reasonable rewards for coming forward, and in fact, it might be mutually beneficial. And that's what started kind of an avenue into what we call sort of the modern day of bug bounties. So what's the situation that we have now? Well, vulnerability disclosure programs are so popular that they're in fact being written into a lot of laws. And in fact, governments are looking at their procurement contracts and they're requiring their vendors to have vulnerability disclosure programs more and more often. But bounties are still not as common. And the reason for this is that there's a lot of issues with not just the triage of these bugs, but essentially what do you do about the bugs even after the triage is completed? So there's a whole lot of more decision making that is typically done still by humans that is a bottleneck and a choke point. Now, how many of you have heard about Apple's bug bounty topping $2 million, right? $2 to $5 million is where they are with this. Now, how many of you think that price is high enough? How many of you think it's too low? All right, there's a few hands going and saying it's too low. Well, actually, it is probably too high. And we could have a whole other talk about the perverse incentives that may be introduced by having bug bounties specifically be too high. Why? Because it actually affects your labor pipeline for prevention and early detection. Eventually, there is literally a U-shaped curve that would be generated if bug bounties get too high and try to directly compete with the offense market. So that is something to consider if you are considering a bug bounty and whether or not you need to have quote-unquote competitive prices. But there's one area, and we'll get into an example, where bug bounties are absolutely taking off, and that is in the crypto blockchain smart contract space, and that is probably understandable in that there is direct money that can be accumulated with some of these attacks. And a lot of the cryptocurrency exchanges and et cetera that are offering bug bounties are offering fractions of what you could, as an attacker, get from a vulnerability that you report in these areas as an incentive to sort of draw those out from the offense market, which is an interesting tactic, especially given what I just said about the possibility of creating perverse incentives and eroding your labor pipeline that will then be your future workers to prevent these vulnerabilities in the first place. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the birth of bug bounties, the early days, and now what is happening in terms of the bug bounty community. Most hackers can't actually earn a living doing bug bounties. It is something that there are a few who have successfully monetized this into a full-time job, but there are relatively few. Even if you see that there's over 1 million hackers that are registered in a given platform, very few of those actually report real vulnerabilities, even fewer get paid, and even fewer get paid anything close to a living wage, where they could make more money or steadier money or both doing professional penetration testing, for example. So there's also been an unfortunate outcome in that it's dispelled the myth of many eyes. I mean, have we actually seen incidents go down because of the adoption of bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure programs? Unfortunately not. And that's because a lot of these programs attack this issue as a way to control the researcher population and the vulnerabilities that are being reported. I always say that non-disclosure agreements do not belong in bug bounty programs or vulnerability disclosure programs. They only belong in contracted work or permanent employment type of work. And a lot of organizations see it differently, saying, well, especially if we're paying for a bug, we should be able to demand that they not disclose that vulnerability no matter what happens. Unfortunately, in the dynamic of bug bounties, only the first person ever gets paid. It's kind of like the worst gig economy job you could possibly have, right? So imagine an Uber driver only getting paid if they're the first one to arrive at the airport when they drop when they drop a passenger off. That would not work out very well. And yet, bug bounties are designed exactly like that. Only the first one to report the bug gets paid. So what about all of the other potential finders of that bug? There's no incentive for them, and then there's no implied contract that they need to stay silent on those issues. So while we are seeing increased adoption of these programs, we are seeing them implemented incorrectly, being misused, and unfortunately being treated like a cheaper penetration test. And how many of you have seen penetration tests ignored year over year over year? You've definitely seen it, right? And when I was a penetration tester, used to hate going into certain clients because we could basically just change the data on the report. It was the same report every quarter, every year, however frequently they had us come back. It was the same exact vulnerabilities, or even, more abstractly, the same classes of vulnerabilities over and over again. So right now, in terms of the ability to make a living in bug bounties, it's still, the low-hanging fruit is still the most popular on these platforms, that are hosting a lot of bug bounties. Only this year have cross-site scripting vulnerabilities gone down in the whole history of them measuring these, the most common bugs that come through. And that's not because organizations have gotten better or smarter. It's because the frameworks have updated such that they're doing a lot of filtration via the framework. And so it's been that type of shift, not a shift in organizational maturity, but framework maturity, that has driven any kind of difference in the classes of vulnerabilities that you're seeing get reported through these platforms. So, unfortunately, the world is not more secure because of bug bounties. I would have loved to see a different outcome. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about some specific examples of how AI has affected the bug bounty world. But first, I think it's important to differentiate. We are not talking about vulnerabilities in AI models themselves. And to me, sure, it's a new attack surface, but it's the same types of vulnerabilities that you're seeing, just applied to a different attack surface. It's really not a new vulnerability, and unless it comes from the Nouveau region of France. Otherwise, it's just sparkling same classic vulnerabilities. This is not our focus at this point. I want to turn your attention to an example that just happened this summer. So after about 8 or 9 months of training this AI, Crossbow, this company, climbed to #1 on the HackerOne leaderboard, ahead of every human, even the humans who were using AI, which, according to their latest survey, about 70% of the researchers were using AI to formulate their reports, to help them write their proofs of concept and test their exploit code. So even the humans that were augmenting their work with AI, this AI autonomous system bypassed all of them and climbed to #1 on the leaderboard of HackerOne. So how did they do that? They absolutely took advantage of, one, having some of the best experts in vulnerability discovery working on that Crossbow platform. But there was a specific case that I want to call attention to, and this one was interesting to me because if you read the write-up that I've linked to, they had the AI do a lot of reasoning. So it was scanning for vulnerabilities, obviously, doing that on a massive, broad scale. But they found something, the AI found something that it thought was going to lead to direct exploitation. It didn't, but it noticed, as a real human hacker would, that some error messages were coming back that led it further down a path to essentially abuse this include feature to then bypass authentication and then pull some files from the server, proving the vulnerability. So what was interesting to me about this case is that the AI acquired targets, honed in on the most likely targets, tested some things, and responded to the results of the test. That is literally what human hackers would have done in that case. Now again, and I emphasize this AI was specifically trained by some of the best exploit finders and writers in the world. So what it ended up doing was demonstrating the power of AI to automate, to do this at scale, and to surpass all of the humans on the biggest bug bounty platform in the world in less than 9 months. of active work and active research. So what does this mean in terms of the longevity of bug bounty hunting as a career choice or a career path? Well, we were already, when it was just humans competing against humans, already in the territory where most bug bounty hunters cannot make a living doing this, right? But the volume of these classical exploit cases that can be found and exploited by AI agents, it's not a question of how or when. This day has absolutely arrived. And what will logically happen from this is that more and more autonomous use of AI will take the place of these human laborers, right? Who have been unwittingly, in some ways, training the AI to do exactly that. So I mentioned that we would talk about smart contracts. This actually was a paper from Anthropic Research that came out 3 days ago. And what they're demonstrating with this paper, they did a model that had some different AI models working on the same problem, which was how to exploit smart contracts. And they determined a few interesting things, right? Number one, they were able to theoretically extract $4.6 million out of these vulnerable smart contracts. And how were they able to model this? Well, they had these models running against each other. One of them actually generated over 3.5 million of that 4.6 million, and the other one generated, one and change. The one that extracted the most value did so in a way that, again, mirrors what a human might do if their goal is to optimize being able to extract monetary value out of doing this hacking. They found a few vulnerability types in a couple of these smart contracts, and then they took the data set of all the smart contracts and just ran it against the whole data set and was extracting value when they pattern recognized the same type of vulnerable construct in those contracts. So exactly like a human who was looking for not just the most vulnerabilities, but finding one and monetizing the heck out of that on a broad and fast scale. The other interesting thing that this report shows is that the average cost, now, I mentioned that big number, $4.6 million. There's obviously a token cost in AI, and they calculated that there was still a profit margin on average for each vulnerable exploited smart contract of a little over $100, right? That doesn't sound like much, but obviously, as you scale up, a profit is a profit. Most interesting about this, to me, were the numbers that they showed about token costs falling and exploit revenue doubling. So like I said, this paper came out 3 days ago. If you think that this cannot apply to your specific industry, even if you have nothing to do with bug bounties, even if you have nothing to do with smart contracts, you are underestimating the falling cost of actually running some of these AI models and the increasing value of what it can extract for an attacker. Now, I mentioned that a lot of the reason why bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure programs have not actually increased cybersecurity as a whole is because of lack of this internal process of digesting these vulnerabilities, not just fixing them, but understanding the patterns. Because I look at my job as, bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure, they are symptoms of broader issues in your IT environment, in your application development, secure development lifecycle. They are symptoms of missing security controls. And so what organizations struggle with is not just fixing the inbound vulnerabilities, but in taking those lessons learned and applying them so that they're not fixing the same type of vulnerabilities over and over again. And with AI, so I mentioned 70% of the hackers surveyed are using AI in some manner or fashion. Some of it definitely qualifies as AI slop. It is stuff that sounds good, it has all these buzzwords, but it's effectively a hallucination. No real bug there. So those false bugs, the AI slop, the hallucinated bugs, absolutely take time away from triage efforts, logically. But the real bugs do too. And most importantly, we're seeing this effect on open source software, Everyone ever see that XKCD cartoon where there's a little tiny pillar holding up the entire internet stack and it's open source library? This is absolutely true. They are mostly run by volunteers, and even those with paid maintainers have too few paid maintainers to get through all of these AI submissions. We've had some recent complaints come to the surface. The curl maintainer has had enough of the AI slop variety where, it's wasting their time based on these hallucinations, whereas the FFmpeg maintainer had an issue with Google's AI. Big Sleep was finding vulnerabilities and using their AI and sending it to this open source maintainer, and they had a problem with it because, one, Google didn't send a patch or even try to, even though Google does have an AI tool to actually create patches. They didn't use it. And two, even though those are real vulnerabilities, a lot of them were in very obscure codecs. FFmpeg is used to play videos, essentially, and translate codecs. So the problem here with AI encroaching in this space is not just the effect on the human labor market and bug bounty hunters. It's affecting anyone who is receiving a vulnerability report moving forward forever, whether the AI is generating slop or whether it's generating valid security bugs, because the pace is not yet there for AI to then consume those bugs and do something about it. Which brings us to this logical conclusion, right? If you can use AI to find the bugs, why can't you use AI to fix the bugs? I mentioned that Google has this capability and they had not used it. Well, it turns out it is actually more complicated to generate patches, not only patches that are security correct, but also work in terms of their applicability to application compatibility, backwards compatibility, stabilization of the environment. I remember yesterday someone was speaking and they mentioned DLL sideloading and Microsoft's response to that. I happened to work at Microsoft at the time that DLL sideloading was starting to get reported on a broad scale, and I know why it wasn't fixed on a broad scale. That was because of the application layer above what the operating system is actually doing. It takes time for the entire ecosystem of applications to adapt to changes in the underlying OS. So even though you know what the problem is and you know what to do to fix it, sometimes you can't do so because of this application compatibility and complexity issue. So while you can have these great ideas that there's an AI mirror in defense for every AI offense tool, there really isn't, because of some of these more complex things that you have to think about. What's funny about that Anthropic paper, they go through this wonderful analysis. They give us all of these numbers, and they show us, the Anthropic paper on the smart contracts. And it's only the very last line that they say, AI could be used to fix some of these things, so get on that. That's it in terms of what's been dedicated and devoted towards the defensive side in a lot of these areas. And I don't blame folks, right? Everybody thinks offense is more sexy than defense. Everybody is looking for that next hack, that next 0-day, that next threat actor who's exploiting things, as opposed to really glamorizing, the thing that was prevented because you did this defensive thing. So, unfortunately, there is a continuing asymmetry between the offensive use of AI and the defensive use of AI. So what does that mean for people? That means certainly we are the bottleneck on the defensive side. And even when we're trying to augment our defensive work with AI, it's still taking expert-level, nuanced understanding of the environment in which you operate in order to make these fixes reasonable, good, and won't do more damage than they do good. So how is this squeezing the labor market? And how might this apply to your area? Because literally none of you do anything to do with bug bounties. There is a historical parallel in how the labor market was squeezed in the early part of the 2000s. So there was a ramp up of professional penetration testing, the first professionalization of the hacking industry, where we were hired as experts, we were paid very well. Suddenly there was some additional tooling that was available. It allowed lower skilled workers to run these tools, and to someone at an organization who is looking at their budget, and saying, well, I want a pen test. This says it's a pen test, but it's actually just some junior operator running a tool, versus these are true experts, and they're very expensive. They're going to choose, when they're not otherwise informed that there is a difference between the outcomes, they're going to choose the cheaper option. So penetration testing already went through this squeezing of the labor market. And what happened was penetration testing prices, salaries, they all pretty much stagnated at the same level that they were roughly 20 plus years ago. So AI will risk repeating this type of cycle where even if we know that AI can't make as good decisions, that will not understand the complexity involved in especially the defensive side of things, that organizations looking at their budget bottom line will still make that same mistake of thinking it's either just as good or good enough, and choosing those solutions instead. So that definitely risks us losing and compressing our essential environment here of the labor market. What does this do for the future of cybersecurity, whether it's in bug bounties or any other area? When those entry-level jobs start disappearing because AI is replacing them, we cut off our ability to get to expert level and grow our field in terms of human experts, the people who are required to guide the AI to make better decisions, no matter what it's applied to. So if newcomers can't earn cash doing bug bounties, there may be fewer of them learning these skills. We've seen studies already showing that when someone is given a task and they are told you can't use any AI versus you can use AI to do initial research, but you've got to do the task yourself, versus you can have AI do the entire task, when asked about the task afterwards, those that had AI involved, and especially at the highest levels of saying you can just have AI do it, they could not recite a single thing from the task. They did not go through the mental exercise themselves. And so we risk not just eliminating jobs, but eliminating the human reasoning that goes into making these decisions in the future. So, everybody right now is touting that, AI by itself, probably problematic hallucinations. Humans on their own, they can't scale as well. So this, superpower is when you combine humans and AI, humans in the loop. And they're telling you this as if that's the problem solved. But like I said, the market is going to dictate what solutions are chosen. And in the end, we're going to end up here instead. A triple derpy dragon of humans don't know how to make the right solutions. Humans plus AI, that's the derpiest of all, So how do we fix this? And I'm pretty sure I'm almost out of time, but how do we fix this? Because it's not just about AI and bug bounties. AI is transforming our entire industry, our entire world. It's not just our industry that is being transformed right now. So obviously, we need to have humans guiding the creation of this AI. So like I said, Crossbow is a great example where they have experts, deciding how to train those models to be the most efficient and correct, which is great. But how do we cover that gap where we have to create an intentional way to grow the next generation of human operators when we have cut off some of these career entry points, right? Of course, we want AI to be used as early in the software development lifecycle as possible to prevent some of those classes of bugs in the first place. But how many organizations do proper secure development lifecycle now, and how many of them are actually going to integrate AI into their CI/CD pipelines and catch these things before they even materialize? Not as many as you think, not as many as you want, and that's another conversation about software liability down the road. So here's where I'm going to take a wild turn. Brace yourselves. Are you ready? I think one of the big solutions here is UBI, Universal Basic Income. I am not the first to suggest this. In fact, a lot of the big names in AI are saying that this is an inevitable outcome of what AI is going to bring to the world and the workforce, is that there will be a need for UBI. But I'm taking it a step further and suggesting that not only is UBI the right way to go, but it should come as a logical dividend. As part of AI is being trained by us and our work and our expertise, we should be getting a piece of their, I won't say profits, none of those AI companies are profitable, but I will say revenue, right? We should be getting a piece of their revenue. So in your jobs, how many of you are using AI right now? Absolutely almost all of you. How many of you have been told to use AI by your management? Yes, absolutely. So you are not just using it and you're not cheating, you're being encouraged to use it. How many of you have worried about what this might do to your specific role now or in the future? Not enough of you. But if there were UBI, and if we were consciously taking it from the AI companies that are profiting, eventually will profit on our work, not profitable now, but will eventually profit from our work. Certainly, they are building their models based on our work. I think this is probably the only way forward in what we are now in, which is an industrial revolution. So how many of you have heard the numbers before? Pre-industrial revolution, there was X percentage of global population was involved in agriculture as their job, right? So it's a couple of you have heard of that. So in the UK, the numbers were something like 64% of all employed people before the Industrial Revolution were involved in agriculture, and it dropped to around 10 or 11% after the Industrial Revolution. So the fact of the matter is, all of our jobs are changing. We are in an industrial revolution. How we respond to this, beyond just using these tools to our current immediate advantage in scope and scale, is what will determine our future, not just as individuals, but as a society. What happened in the Industrial Revolution, in addition to shifting the labor force out of agriculture and into manufacturing, there was a lot of labor upheaval. That was a bad time to be working in a factory, right? Leaving the farm and going to the city to make your way in this new industrialized economy. Underpayment, overwork, et cetera. And we can also see what happened to the leftover humans who are left working in agriculture. They are not treated very well. They are not paid very well. So while we all enjoy our relatively comfortable roles in our life in cybersecurity today, we are definitely at this precipice where tons of the jobs that were available to us and the career paths that were available to us are no longer going to be in existence. And even if the industry doesn't essentially marketize our jobs out of existence, some jobs that are eliminated will never return. I want to warn you that AI's role in a lot of the companies that are deeply invested in it, this is a Waymo, this is a self-driving car, a lot of their end game is to eliminate humans almost entirely, if not entirely. They use the humans to seed the marketplace and get demand, and in a lot of ways help train and refine the training of their automated workforce. But that is ultimately the end game. So, as I said, bug bounties are kind of the worst gig economy job that there is because you're not guaranteed payment, whereas an Uber or Lyft driver is guaranteed payment if they do the work. I think at this point, what we're all looking at is that we're training our replacements. And while we can't risk being left behind by not using AI, we have to understand what it is that we're trading off and try to make very conscious decisions while we are still able to influence the companies that are taking over some of our jobs and learning from us as they go. Now, I saw this graffiti when I was in Italy. And while I'm not saying the future is that we all don't work, I am saying that the future that we should be demanding is one where our work is purposeful, where we are engaging in community-based learning, where we are creating a pipeline for others to come after us and become the experts of tomorrow so that AI is not steering itself effectively and incorrectly. And we should be demanding this as part of what we do in our everyday adoption of AI. So, last thoughts before I go to maybe one question if I've got time, is that we as a society have a responsibility to understand where we are in history. Those numbers that I was showing you of the dropping costs of AI and the increasing profitability in exploits that you can do, that's just one aspect. You are seeing this adoption happen way faster than the Industrial Revolution happened. And the transformation is not going to stop because you're not ready for it. The fact of the matter is, advocating for UBI at this point is probably our best way forward. And that way we can work on what we want to work on, create the systems that serve humanity, and we can dream more, which is something AI can't do. So you've noticed there's been this cat throughout the presentation. My cat, one of them, is an expert at essentially having me be the outsourced labor for all the work they don't want to do, providing them with everything they need, and they live this life of leisure. So I will leave you with this: work less, dream more, be more like my cat. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katie. You not just lived up to, but surpassed the very high expectations I put on.
It was the cat.
It was the cat.
Yeah.
Like always the cat.
Yeah.
It will. We'll just, if you don't mind, we'll overrun a little bit into lunch. We have so many questions. That's why I brought my phone up. I'm not just being really rude.
Oh my goodness.
So I'm just going to try and triage a couple really quickly by mushing them together. Let's start just. We'll do a couple. Let's just start with things on bug bounties. So a bit of a fun set. Because they're coming from opposite ends. You know, the wildest bug report you've ever seen that says this person deserves a medal, not just a payout. On the other hand, you know, have you ever just thought, the report says it's fixed after turning it off and on again, and you should give them a bounty just for honesty?
So what's the question, though?
The question is, what's the wildest, what are some of the maddest cases you've ever sort of seen in bug bounty world?
I mean, I've submitted bugs, and they've tried to pay me off with a bug bounty and tried to get me to sign off on non-disclosure agreements. And I've said, no, thank you. If it qualifies for a bounty, please donate it. I want to see it fixed. Sadly, they didn't really fix it. They cosmetically fixed it. So, of course, I publicly disclosed it, and people are, can kind of clutch their pearls about it. But that's honestly, to me, I think one of the biggest tools that researchers have is public disclosure. I always say the disclosure and vulnerability disclosure stands for disclosure, right? And a lot of people will misunderstand that as I'm advocating for just, wild releases of exploits. But I mean, I think, whether you are a bug bounty hunter or a threat hunter that has stumbled across a new vulnerability and you want to report it, there is an element of having to hold vendors accountable. Right. Such that they don't sit on it forever, even if you are, trying to do the right thing and give them time to fix it. There is a point of no return in terms of you are exposing more users to risk than you are protecting them by staying quiet.
Good, because that answers another couple of questions, including what should you do with companies that make billions and don't pay for the bugs? I think you've answered that. You disclose it. But someone was worrying about, you said that extremely high bounties are perverse, but is there not going to be a criminal incentive for researchers to sell to exploit brokers? I suspect I know the answer to that as well, but... So
criminals, I call it the offense market. There are legitimate and legal uses of buying vulnerabilities and exploits for offensive purposes, right? If you are a government and you are trying to target terrorists or child traffickers, you might want to buy some 0 days and use them for legitimate purposes. That offense market, whether it's for criminal offense use or positive offense use, like I said, there's logically no ceiling. They can go as high as they want. So if you're sitting there increasing the defensive bounties, trying to keep up with them, you are making a huge mistake. This is what I'm talking about with apples, where it is a U-shaped curve in terms of eventually you are going to incentivize people hoarding their vulnerabilities, waiting for you to reward them at higher and higher levels, and not joining your workforce for prevention. So I think that's the answer.
So, and just turning to AI, there's a sort of couple of questions that broadly fit under the AI slop bucket. One is, and it's a theme of being overwhelmed by mediocrity. Mm-hmm. On the organizational side, AI just overwhelming systems with nonsense. But actually, there's a really interesting question on the offensive side. Is AI slop almost an adversarial advantage just by burning defense resources? What do you reckon?
Yes, absolutely. And burning defense resources can happen in so many different ways. This is increasing that burn rate. There's almost nobody we've found who stays in those response positions for longer than a couple of years. Very rarely do they stay in those direct response positions. Sometimes they can vary their work and their burnout rate by doing other things, but almost always they will want to permanently rotate off of having to answer these terrible, often terrible bug reports.
Okay, right, and heroically I'll try and group lots of questions about skills and people into one go. And essentially the theme here is, are you saying that we maybe need to recapture some of the values of the early industry in terms of, doing things for the public good, and that it's sort of over commercialized? People are saying really glad to you talk about the labor squeeze, but how do you communicate that to executives? Is AI simply going to fill lots of cyber jobs? And is all of this, particularly around universal basic income and so forth, how realistic is saying, let's be better people in an industry like this? To finish on, because I know you're really passionate about it, so that's as best I can wrap up about 4 or 5 different questions into one go.
Well, I'll kind of take the end because that's the one I remember. How realistic is UBI? OpenAI sponsors UBI experiments. They sponsor their own, they sponsor other organizations. They are definitely on this page that they have to pay attention to this because they understand what will happen to capitalism, which they depend on right now, to eventually become profitable. What will happen to capitalism if there are too few jobs and people don't have money, right? So this is one way, in a lot of ways, to prop up late-stage capitalism. So I don't think it needs to rely on the kindness in our hearts. It relies on the same profiteering mechanisms that have driven this industry in that direction in the first place. It's the same reason why Ford Motor Company had to start increasing the wages of its own workers so that they could afford to buy the cars.
Well, that answers all the questions that my complicated multi-question meant that you couldn't remember. So thank you. Please, one more time for the brilliant Katie Moussouris. Katie, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.